Welcome once again. This is the sort of main part one, not the introduction part, but this is the first bit where we're actually going to get into the document of the occulted powers of the British Constitution in order to explain the constitutional law principles that are being put out by commonlawconstitution.org and lawandalchemy.org. So let's get straight into that. So as I said in the introduction, I'm going to be going through this section by section. I'm going to be reading it, and then we're going to expand on it and have some extra information on that as well. So here it is, the occulted powers of the British Constitution. So let's begin with the quotation by Lysander Spooner. I'm just going to read that. "It is in the administration of justice or of law that the freedom or subjection of a people is tested. If this administration be in accordance with the arbitrary will of the legislator, the government is a despotism, and the people are slaves. If, on the other hand, the rule of decision be those principles of natural equity and justice, which constitute, or at least are embodied in, the general conscience of mankind, the people are free in just so far as that conscience is enlightened." Right, okay, so let's just think about that very quickly. So Lysander Spooner has this ability to just put this so succinctly. Now that quotation's taken from his 1852 essay on trial by jury, and that's available, by the way, for download, and you should read that too in its entirety. Excuse me, it's downloadable from commonlawconstitution.org website, and it's in the resources section. And in fact, what that does is it takes you to a site that's dedicated to this essay, and you can download it in all sorts of different forms. You can download it as PDF, HTML, different ways. So I really would recommend that you do that. But so this quotation is taken from that essay, and what he's basically saying is that you can't have it more than one of two ways. Only two ways does this work. Yeah, so it's either that the government gets to exercise its arbitrary will as a legislator, in which case we're in big trouble, because that automatically leads to tyranny. Ultimately, even if you have a well-meaning government initially, it's always going to go that way, and it always has. And the other possibility, and there's nothing in between that's possible, is that the people themselves are essentially the final arbiter of law, and they are in authority over their own government, in inverted commas, but actually it isn't a government in that situation, really, because the governing ultimately is being done by the people, and we're going to get into how that is. Yeah, so it's either one situation or the other. It can't be anything in between. And so that's essentially what we're looking at. That sort of embodies what this entire subject is all about, really. Now, the interesting thing, and this is why I've emboldened that last sentence there, in just so far as that conscience is enlightened. Okay, so it's basically saying that the people are free in just so far as that conscience is enlightened. Okay, and what that's really saying is that they are free, but it's essentially down to the consciousness, if you like, of the people themselves. What's the state of consciousness? Okay, and that's quite important, because it's hinting at the fact that even though this might be written down in law, your constitution is not a reality unless the people themselves absolutely hold it, in their hearts, and they constantly are, and they're vehement about their rights, and they fight for it, and they're constantly questioning the establishment. Now, is that what's happened over the last few hundred years? I would argue at times, but generally not, and it's certainly not the case now. And that's the whole point of this exercise, isn't it? Is to try and reverse that effect. But largely, we've been pretty damn hopeless at keeping our constitution at the surface, reminding our public servants that they actually have obligations and limitations placed upon them, which we're going to get into now. So that quotation is absolutely key. Learn it. Learn it off by heart, maybe. It's always good to do that and be able to just trot those things out, in conversation. It's quite fun to be able to do that. Okay, so this is the front cover, obviously, so that just gives you an indication of the version that we're talking about. I mentioned that in the introduction. This is the most recent version. So here it is, the Occulted Powers of the British Constitution, and this first section here is just simply going into what this document is covering, what's the scope of it, and what are its main sources. And its main sources are the 1852 essay by Lysander Spooner, and also that interpreted by Ken Dewdney of the democracydefined.org campaign, and I really would urge you to go onto that website and have a look at the excellent work that he's done as well on this, and maybe even purchase his book, Democracy Defined, The Manifesto, which is a fantastic and important resource as well. So let's get into this. So constitutional limitations on government. So what this is really about, this next little section, and this first part will really be just looking at that one section. So it'll be quite a short video. But what this is looking at what is the purpose of the Constitution, right? And is the Constitution in question, is it actually effective? Because it's either effective or it isn't. You know, I mean, some constitutions will not be effective because they're leaving out the gold, the important aspects, and so we hone in on what those are. So let's just read it, and then we'll perhaps comment a little bit more broadly. So it stands to reason that unless the people of the country have powers over their own government, the people will eventually find themselves in a place of tyranny. Unless limitations are placed upon the government, and more specifically, how it creates legislation, that government will eventually write itself into a position of absolute power, because power ultimately lies with those that can deliver punishment. It's a slightly negative way of putting it, but it's absolutely true. Yeah, so the enforcers behind law within your community, if you know, they're the ones with the power, essentially. And so if they can create law through their own lawmaking mechanism, because government has a lawmaking mechanism called the legislature, if that legislature has the power to create any laws that they like, then they'll enforce them and they'll make those laws as well, and that's a big problem. Continuing on. So unless one concedes to a system of despotism, any thinking individual must realise that the government is indeed ultimately subordinate to the sovereignty of the people. Unfortunately, the prevailing thinking in our society is that this is achieved through nothing more than the mechanisms of voting in elections. The idea that the people have influence over their own government merely by voting representatives into office. Yeah, so, you know, that's true, isn't it? Most people in society think that the only way they have influence over their own government is by voting. Every few years, and that's really the only way that they think that, you know, the people actually have that influence over their own government. So what we're hinting at already is that no, that's not the case. That's not true. There's something else that's been hidden, occulted. Okay. Carrying on, a constitutional framework can only be truly equitable. That means we're all equal before the law, and furthermore, the people can only be truly sovereign if they are able to take part in the process of the formation and even the enforcement of the laws of their community. It is not the job of a people's government to decide on the justice of the laws of the community and simultaneously to be responsible for their enforcement. That would be the definition of dictatorship. For true equity to exist, the people must have that authority over their own governing administration, meaning that, in fact, the people govern themselves. See, that's the key. That's what we're aiming for here, is a society in which the people actually govern themselves. Otherwise, you've outsourced your governance, yeah, to something else, to a government, right? And we're asking that question: is that what's happened? Or is it in fact not what's happened? And in fact, the Constitution is upholding the idea that the people should be governing themselves. That's what we're effectively suggesting here. So just that last little sentence there, a couple of sentences. The people must not see their government as authority. If government retains the ultimate power to punish without the authority of the people, then the people will ultimately be in fear of their government. Okay, so that's that little first bit out the way, but you can see there's a kind of logic to this and even without looking at sort of documentary history and seeing the proof of it, even without that, what's emerging here is that there is a kind of inevitability here, which I often talk about. The fact that you almost don't need documents to prove this stuff. Why? Because it's kind of self-evident. Yeah, it's just logical. It has to operate that way, and if it doesn't operate that way and elevate the people in authority over their own government, then you're going to have a people of slaves, essentially. It's kind of one or the other. It can't be anything else. And so that inevitability is quite a powerful piece of evidence in its own right. It's almost really the most important evidence of this, that you can demonstrate it to yourself through logic. You can work it through in your own mind. So even if we weren't to have the historical documents to support this, it can't operate any other way. Excuse me. So moving on, so the ultimate question might be whether or not there is some other mechanism, other than voting rights, that allows the people to decide on the justice of the laws of their community, to decide on the fairness of the laws by which they agree to abide. That hidden mechanism does indeed exist in Britain, but either mendacious and conniving members of the establishment at various points have been effective at hiding it and removing it from the consciousness of the people, or a protracted and cumulative process of self-delusion and double-thinking has taken place within society at large. Now that paragraph is quite important, and it actually does, that was rewritten actually in this edition, and it represents a slight shift in my characterisation of the way I believe that things are actually operating, really. Okay, so what it's doing, the first bit down to here is basically leaving the door open for the possibility that there actually really are people behind the scenes that full knowledge that they are in some way perhaps taking part in the hiding of this information. Yeah, and they absolutely know what they're doing, and they're happy to bring a condition of enslavement about in the people. Okay, so I'm leaving the door open for that possibility that this is actual, I'm going to use the C word, conspiracy. Okay, does that actually exist? Yes, I think it does, but I think we know that to a degree, but I think that what I've come to understand is that there's less of that, in fact, than we might believe. I think what it's more of, which is this second part of that sentence, or a protracted and cumulative process of self-delusion and double-thinking has taken place within society at large. And what that is really a reflection, and this is to do with my research in getting into human psychology and sort of the nature of consciousness. And what it really is, in a way, is a kind of messed up thinking. This is kind of a psychosis, if you like, which is an illness of the mind that pervades society broadly at large. And what we're really saying is that that those in the establishment who might be happy to go along with this distortion are doing it partly through fear and of losing control, I think. And I think that that's probably a slightly more mature understanding of what's actually happening, rather than constantly saying, hurling abuse at the other side and saying they're all out to get us and they're rubbing their hands with glee and saying, and taking our liberties away from us. I don't think it's quite that, actually, with most of them. But as I say, I think that might be the case with one or two, certainly with a few. Let's carry on. This elusive mechanism is trial by jury itself, judicium parium in Latin, as enshrined in the original 1215 Magna Carta. The important point, however, is that these common law mechanisms, in their true authentic form, bear little resemblance to the watered-down, pale imitation that exists today. The original judicium parium of the time of the late Saxon kings functioned as the champion of the citizen juror and kept all people of the country in authority over their own government and its legislation. Put another way, the common law, legem terrae, the law of the land, laid out in the 1215 Magna Carta, was what made the governing, and in brackets there, administration genuinely by, for, and of the people. Right, so that's borrowing a little bit of language from the founding fathers of the United States Constitution, yeah, which is this inevitability of it. The fact that, they were using language like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, I think it is, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like that, which is, it's going back to what I was saying about the inevitability of this, that it's just logical. You can just show yourself that this couldn't possibly function in any other way, right? And in many ways, that, I think, is the most powerful argument, really, for all of this. Even if the historical documents were not to be there, I think it's less powerful to be able to prove your argument for the existence of something like this, the Constitution, in just being able to show it in logic and reasoning. And that's what this inevitability, as I like to call it, is really all about. And the founding fathers of the United States Constitution really understood that too. So there we go. So that's the first part of the document, which is really just raising the issues of, how can it work, one way or the other, and which is it most likely to be? Because if it's not functioning the way that we would want it to work, then the Constitution itself was never much good anyway in the first place, and therefore, why have we had 800 years worth of people saying, well, the British Constitution or the English Constitution before that has always been this amazing thing, and we've talked about the 1215 Magna Carta as the basis of the people's liberties, and all this sort of grand talk that the establishment actually does still come out with. But how could that possibly be the case, unless it works this way and not the other? Yeah. So that's the purpose of that first section, really, is just raising those broader issues about what is the purpose of a constitution, and it can only work two ways, and it really has to be this way. Otherwise, we might as well just give up and go home at this point. So there we go. So part 2 of is going to be going on to authentic common law trial by jury, and we'll talk about that next. So there we go. That's enough for now, and thanks for watching. Cheers for now.